Hey guys, when people think of ancient China, they often picture emperors, vast walls, famous philosophers, and glittering courts. But most lives were not lived in palaces. They were lived in farmyards, kitchens, workshops, marketplaces, and narrow streets, where ordinary people worried about food, family, taxes, weather, and the fragile routines that held the world together. And once you look closely, daily life in ancient China becomes far more impressive than the grand monuments alone, because it reveals how one of history's longest-lasting civilizations was built hour by hour, season by season, by millions of people whose names were never recorded. And before we begin, if you enjoy calm, thoughtful history like this, consider subscribing. A lot of regular viewers do, simply so they can keep finding these long-form stories without missing the next deep dive. Now, with that said, let us step away from the throne room for a while and into the everyday world of ancient Chinese life. To understand daily life in ancient China, the first thing to remember is that there was never just one single ancient China. It stretched across many centuries, many dynasties, many climates, and many local customs. Life in the early Zhou period was not identical to life under the Han, and life in a northern village was not the same as life in a southern river town. Even so, beneath those differences, certain patterns remained remarkably consistent. Most people lived in rural communities. Most families depended directly or indirectly on agriculture. Social order mattered deeply. Ancestors were honored. Hierarchy was accepted as part of the structure of life, and the household rather than the individual stood at the center of society. For an ordinary family, the rhythm of the day began very early. In agricultural communities, sunrise mattered more than any clock. A household would rise with first light, especially in busy seasons when the difference between a successful harvest and a poor one might come down to labor done at exactly the right time. The home itself was usually modest. Its materials depended on region and wealth. In many places, houses were built from packed earth, timber, reeds, or clay tiles, with wealthier households able to afford stronger wooden frames, larger courtyards, and better roofing. A poor family's dwelling could be dark, smoky, and crowded, with several generations sharing limited space. Yet, even in small homes, the arrangement of domestic life often reflected order and custom. There was a place for cooking, a place for sleeping, a place for storage, and, in families that could manage it, a small area for honoring ancestors. Food dominated daily thought in a very practical sense. In northern China, people relied heavily on millet and later wheat, while in the south rice became increasingly central. These were not just crops. They shaped the entire pattern of labor, diet, and even local identity. For the poor, meals were simple and repetitive. Grain porridge, coarse bread, vegetables, beans, and pickled foods were common. Meat existed, but for many it was an occasional luxury rather than an everyday expectation. A pig or chicken might be far more valuable alive than on the table. Wealthier families had more variety. Finer grains, better cuts of meat, fish, fermented sauces, fruits, and wine. But even then, food was never merely about pleasure. It signaled rank, discipline, hospitality, and the ability of a household to provide stability. The work of preparing food fell largely to women, though in truth the ancient household was an economic unit in which nearly everyone worked. Women cooked, spun thread, wove cloth, cared for children, managed stores, and often joined in agricultural labor as well. Men plowed, repaired tools, handled heavy field work, traveled to market, and served in labor or military obligations when required. Children were not separated from the working world in the modern sense. From an early age, they learned by watching, carrying, sorting, feeding animals, gathering fuel, or helping with water. Elderly family members, if they survived into old age, could hold an honored place in the home, especially as guardians of memory, ritual, and discipline. In principle, respect for age was a moral duty. In practice, as in any society, much depended on resources, temperament, and circumstance. Clothing also reflected both practicality and hierarchy. For commoners, garments were usually plain, functional, and made from hemp or other coarse materials. Silk, so closely associated with China in the modern imagination, certainly existed and became one of its most famous products, but it was not the everyday fabric of the poor. Fine silk was expensive, refined, and closely tied to status. The cut of clothing could be simple, but the quality of the cloth, the color, and the ornamentation often revealed where a person stood in society. In many periods, dress codes became formal expressions of order, especially for officials. To wear the wrong fabric or display luxury beyond one's station could be seen not just as vanity, but as a challenge to the moral arrangement of society. That moral arrangement was reinforced through family life. Ancient Chinese society placed immense value on filial piety, the duty children owed to parents and ancestors. This ideal shaped behavior inside the home and beyond it. A son was expected to honor his father, a younger brother his elder brother, a wife her husband, and all of them the ancestors whose sacrifices and labor had made the family's existence possible. These ideas were later elaborated with great force by Confucian teaching, but they were rooted in older traditions of kinship and ritual. Daily life, then, was never simply private. It was moral. How one greeted elders, how one mourned, how one married, how one inherited property, and how one maintained the family line were all judged within a larger framework of order and duty. Marriage was less about romance than about alliance, continuity, and household management. Families arranged marriages with careful attention to compatibility, reputation, and practical benefit. Once married, a woman typically joined her husband's household, where she might live not only with him but with his parents and other relatives. This arrangement could provide support, but it could also create tension, especially in homes where resources were limited or authority was strict. Producing children, and especially sons, mattered because sons continued the ancestral line and were expected to care for parents in old age. Infertility, widowhood, or the absence of male heirs could become serious family concerns, not simply emotional disappointments. Outside the home, village life depended on cooperation as much as hierarchy. Fields had to be worked in season. Irrigation systems, where they existed, needed maintenance. Paths, dikes, and shared spaces had to be watched and repaired. Festivals and rituals marked the year, not as entertainment alone, but as part of the agricultural and spiritual order. Seasonal observances linked the living to the dead, the household to the community, and human labor to the cycles of heaven and earth. People prayed for rain, feared flood and drought, and interpreted natural events in moral as well as practical terms. In a world where harvest failure could mean hunger, weather carried enormous emotional weight. Taxation and state demands were part of life for many households. Ancient Chinese governments, especially in stronger dynasties, sought grain, labor, and military service from the population. The exact burden varied by time and place, but the state was never a distant abstraction. It could appear in the form of census registration, tax collectors, corvée labor, road construction, wall building, canal work, or conscription. For peasants, this meant that survival was tied not just to nature but to bureaucracy. A family might manage its own land competently and still be thrown into hardship by excessive demands, local corruption, or political instability. This is one reason the rise and fall of dynasties mattered so much to ordinary people. Stability at the top often meant predictability below. Disorder at the top could mean displacement, heavier burdens, or violence moving across the countryside. In towns and cities, daily life looked different. Urban China was home to merchants, craftsmen, officials, laborers, innkeepers, entertainers, scribes, and servants. Markets were lively places where one could hear regional accents, smell cooked food, see tools, fabrics, pottery, medicines, animals, and luxury goods changing hands. Workshops produced bronze items, lacquerware, ceramics, textiles, paper in later periods, and countless everyday necessities. The city offered opportunity, but also crowding, surveillance, and sharp social distinction. Officials and educated elites might live behind walls in more comfortable compounds, while laborers lived in cramped quarters and survived through unstable work. Yet cities also concentrated learning, religion, and administration. They were places where written culture mattered more visibly, where laws were posted, records kept, and careers, at least in some periods, could be advanced through education. Literacy, however, remained limited compared to the total population. Writing Chinese characters required sustained study, time, and resources that made literacy a source of prestige and power. Scribes, tutors, clerks, and scholars occupied an important social position because they could do what most people could not: read orders, compose letters, interpret classical texts, keep accounts, and navigate the world of official communication. Over time, especially under the influence of Confucian ideals, Education became one of the great pathways to status for families able to invest in it. But for the average farming household, formal learning was often secondary to immediate labor needs. A child's hands were useful in the field long before his mind could be tested on the classics. Religion and belief were woven naturally into everyday routine. Ancestor worship was among the most enduring features of Chinese life, expressing the conviction that the dead remained morally connected to the living. Offerings, memorial rites, and careful burial customs all reflected this bond. Alongside ancestral rites, people also turned to local spirits, protective deities, divination practices, and later to organized traditions such as Taoism and Buddhism. Depending on the period, illness might be treated with herbs, practical remedies, and traditional medical theories, but it could also raise spiritual questions. Misfortune was rarely seen as random in a purely modern sense. It might reflect imbalance, neglect of ritual, poor governance, or the mysterious operation of forces beyond ordinary understanding. Even leisure, where it existed, tended to sit close to structure and custom. Music, storytelling, board games, festivals, archery, drinking, and seasonal gatherings all had a place in different settings. But for most people, especially the poor, leisure was not a large separate category. Rest came when labor allowed it. Celebration was tied to the calendar, the harvest, a marriage, a birth, or a local observance. The ordinary person in ancient China likely had far less unstructured time than many people imagine. Life was demanding, repetitive, and vulnerable to interruption. And yet it was not empty. It was filled with relationships, obligations, inherited meanings, and habits so deeply rooted that they could make a vast empire feel legible at the level of one household. What is perhaps most striking is how much of ancient Chinese civilization depended on these ordinary routines enduring across generations. Dynasties rose and fell, capitals shifted, philosophies competed, and frontiers expanded or contracted. But the civilization itself was continuously rebuilt in kitchens, fields, shrines, schools, and courtyards. It survived because daily life taught people where they stood, what they owed, what they feared, and what they hoped to pass on. The great achievement of ancient China was not only that it produced famous rulers, inventions, and texts. It was that it created a durable social world in which millions of ordinary people, under very different conditions, could still recognize the same broad moral and cultural order. And when we look at ancient Chinese daily life in that way, it becomes something larger than a collection of historical details. It becomes the quiet foundation of one of the longest civilizational stories on Earth. In many villages, the agricultural calendar quietly determined almost everything people did. Spring was a time of preparation and urgency. Fields had to be cleared, soil broken, irrigation channels checked, and seeds planted at the correct moment. Missing the proper planting window could weaken the entire year's harvest. Tools were simple compared to modern machinery, but they were effective when used with knowledge passed down through generations. wooden plows, iron blades in later periods, hoes, baskets, and animal labor, especially oxen, formed the backbone of rural production. Each member of the household contributed in some way, because farming was rarely the work of a single individual. It was a collective effort, carefully timed to weather and season. Summer then brought long days of maintenance and vigilance. Crops needed protection from weeds, pests, and unpredictable rain. Farmers watched the sky closely. Too little water threatened the crop, but too much could destroy it just as easily. Flooding rivers, especially along major waterways like the Yellow River, had the power to reshape entire landscapes. A single disastrous flood could bury villages, ruin fields, and force communities to relocate. Because of this constant risk, managing water became one of the most important concerns in ancient Chinese society. Irrigation systems, canals, dikes, and drainage projects required coordination beyond the household level, often involving the local community or state authorities. By autumn, attention turned toward harvest. This was one of the most intense periods of the year. Grain had to be cut, gathered, dried, and stored before spoilage or early winter weather threatened the supply. Storage itself required careful planning. Families kept grain in containers, pits, or raised structures designed to protect it from moisture and rodents. A good harvest meant relative security for the coming months. A poor harvest could bring anxiety that lingered all winter. For many households, the margin between sufficiency and hardship was narrow. Winter, in contrast, slowed the pace of outdoor agricultural work. But it was far from idle. Inside the household, other forms of labor continued. Women often spent long hours spinning thread and weaving cloth, producing garments and household textiles that the family needed throughout the year. Repairing tools, maintaining buildings, preparing preserved foods, and crafting everyday objects also filled the colder months. Winter was a season when stories, traditions, and family memory were often shared more frequently, reinforcing the cultural knowledge that connected generations. Markets played a quiet but important role in linking these small agricultural worlds together. Most villages were not completely self-sufficient. People still needed tools, salt, ceramics, medicines, and occasionally luxury goods that could not be produced locally. Periodic markets allowed farmers and craftsmen to exchange surplus goods, sell produce, and acquire items necessary for daily life. These markets were also places where information traveled. News about distant events, government policies, local disputes, or natural disasters spread through conversation between traders, travelers, and villagers. Through these simple exchanges, the broader empire gradually became visible to ordinary people. Even those who rarely traveled far from home understood that they were part of a much larger system, one governed by officials, laws, and traditions that extended far beyond their village boundaries. And in this way, the everyday routines of farming, family life, and community cooperation quietly connected millions of households into the wider structure of ancient Chinese civilization. Beyond the fields and village homes, another important layer of daily life in ancient China unfolded through craftsmanship and skilled labor. While the majority of the population farmed, many communities also depended on artisans whose work provided the tools and goods necessary for everyday survival. Blacksmiths forged iron tools, knives, and farming equipment. Potters shaped clay into storage jars, cooking vessels, and bowls used in nearly every household. Carpenters constructed carts, furniture, doors, and roof beams that supported homes and public buildings. These crafts required years of learning, often passed down from parent to child within the same family. Workshops could be small and humble, sometimes attached directly to the artisan's home. In larger towns, however, groups of craftsmen often gathered along specific streets where similar trades clustered together. The sounds of hammering metal, shaping wood, or turning pottery wheels were familiar features of urban life. These craftsmen occupied a distinct position in society. They were not farmers, yet they were not part of the scholarly elite either. Instead, they formed a practical middle layer of skilled workers whose labor supported both rural and urban economies. Among the most remarkable crafts of ancient China was silk production. The process of raising silkworms and weaving silk fabric required delicate care and patience. Families involved in sericulture carefully cultivated mulberry trees, whose leaves fed the silkworms. The worms spun cocoons of fine silk thread, which could then be unwound and woven into fabric. Producing silk was labor-intensive, but the results were highly valued. Over time, silk became not only a luxury material for clothing, but also an important trade good that traveled across vast distances. Through trade routes that later became known as the Silk Road, Chinese silk reached Central Asia, the Middle East, and even parts of the Roman world. Education, though limited for most people, was another quiet element shaping daily life. In families that could afford it, boys might study reading, writing, and classical texts under the guidance of a tutor or local teacher. Learning the Chinese writing system demanded discipline and repetition, since each character had to be memorized carefully. The purpose of education was not only practical literacy but also moral formation. Students studied teachings that emphasized respect, responsibility, and proper conduct within society. These ideas reinforced the belief that personal behavior and social harmony were deeply connected. For the small number of individuals who pursued advanced study, education offered a path into government service. Over time, particularly in later dynasties, systems of examination allowed talented scholars to compete for official positions. Although this opportunity was limited and difficult to achieve, the ideal itself became powerful. It suggested that knowledge and dedication could elevate a person beyond the circumstances of birth, even if only a few succeeded. Daily life also included moments of celebration and communal gathering. Festivals marked the passing of seasons and reinforced cultural traditions. Some festivals honored ancestors or local deities, while others celebrated the changing agricultural cycle. Lanterns, music, food, and ritual activities brought communities together in ways that temporarily eased the hardships of ordinary labor. These events strengthened social bonds and reminded people that their lives were part of a larger cultural rhythm shared across the region. Through craft, learning, and communal tradition, ancient Chinese society maintained a balance between labor and meaning. Even the simplest activities, spinning thread, shaping clay, teaching a child to write, or preparing food for a festival, contributed to a civilization that valued continuity and order. And within those daily routines, generation after generation quietly carried forward the knowledge that allowed Chinese culture to endure across centuries. Another important part of daily life in ancient China was the structure of social hierarchy, which shaped how people interacted with one another in nearly every setting. Society was traditionally viewed as a layered order, often described in broad groups such as scholars, farmers, artisans, and merchants. While real life was always more complex than this simple structure suggests, the idea itself carried powerful meaning. Scholars were placed at the top because learning, moral discipline, and service to government were considered essential for maintaining social harmony. Farmers were respected because they produced the food that sustained the entire population. Artisans created useful goods, while merchants, although sometimes wealthy, were often viewed with suspicion because their profits came from trade rather than direct production. For ordinary people, this hierarchy was not simply a theory found in books. It influenced daily behavior, expectations, and opportunities. A village farmer might never meet a high-ranking scholar or government official, yet the influence of educated administrators could still be felt through laws, taxes, and local governance. Officials appointed by the state managed counties, collected taxes, settled disputes, and enforced imperial policies. Their presence reminded communities that the authority of the emperor extended far beyond the capital city. Government administration required careful record-keeping. Officials relied on written documents to track population numbers, tax obligations, and land ownership. Census records allowed the state to understand how many households lived within a particular region and what resources those households could contribute. For families, being registered meant becoming part of a larger bureaucratic system. It brought obligations, but it could also provide a measure of protection and stability if the administration was fair and competent. Communication between government and people often traveled slowly. Messages might pass through local offices, traveling couriers, or written proclamations displayed in public areas. Because many villagers could not read, announcements were sometimes explained aloud by those who were literate. In this way, information filtered gradually through the layers of society, shaping how people understood events happening far beyond their immediate surroundings. Transportation and travel also played a subtle role in everyday life. Most people rarely traveled great distances. Their world was often centered on the fields, nearby villages, and local market towns. Yet China's growing network of roads, canals, and river routes allowed goods and people to move across much wider regions. Merchants transported salt, grain, iron tools, cloth, and other commodities between markets. Government couriers carried official messages. Pilgrims and scholars traveled in search of knowledge or religious insight. River transport in particular became extremely important. China's major rivers served as natural highways, allowing heavy cargo to be moved more efficiently than overland routes. Boats carried grain from fertile farming regions to cities where large populations depended on steady food supplies. These waterways quietly connected distant regions of the empire, making it possible for urban centers to grow while still being supported by rural agriculture. Within towns and cities, daily life had its own rhythm shaped by commerce and administration. Streets could be crowded with vendors, porters carrying goods, and travelers arriving from surrounding areas. Shops displayed pottery, tools, fabrics, herbal medicines, and prepared foods. Tea houses, which later became important social gathering places, offered spaces where people could rest, talk, and exchange news. Despite the activity of urban centers, life was rarely easy for the working population. Labor was physically demanding, and financial security could be uncertain. Craftsmen depended on steady demand for their products, while merchants faced the risks of travel, fluctuating prices, and changing regulations. Yet cities also offered opportunities unavailable in rural villages. Skilled workers might earn better incomes, and merchants could build networks that expanded far beyond a single region. Religion and philosophy continued to guide personal behavior within this complex society. Confucian teachings emphasized respect, loyalty, and moral responsibility within relationships. Taoist traditions encouraged balance with the natural world and attention to harmony within the body and environment. Later, Buddhism introduced ideas about suffering, compassion, and spiritual awakening. These belief systems did not always replace one another. Instead, many people incorporated elements from each into their daily lives. Household altars, temple visits, seasonal rituals, and offerings to ancestors remained common features of family life. These practices provided emotional comfort and a sense of continuity. They reminded people that their existence was connected to both the past and the future, linking generations through shared memory and responsibility. Health and medicine formed another quiet but essential part of daily life in ancient China. Illness was an unavoidable reality in a world without modern sanitation, antibiotics, or advanced surgical techniques. Yet ancient Chinese society developed a sophisticated understanding of health that combined observation, herbal knowledge, and philosophical ideas about balance within the body. People believed that well-being depended on harmony between natural forces often described as yin and yang, as well as the proper flow of vital energy throughout the body. When illness appeared, it was often understood as a disruption of this balance. Local healers and physicians relied heavily on herbal medicine. Plants, roots, minerals, and animal products were carefully studied and combined into remedies intended to restore equilibrium. Many of these treatments were recorded in early medical texts and passed down through generations of practitioners. A healer might examine a patient's pulse, observe their complexion, ask about symptoms, and recommend a combination of herbs prepared as teas, powders, or pastes. Some treatments also involved acupuncture, a technique that used thin needles placed at specific points on the body to influence the flow of energy. Although ancient practitioners explained these methods through traditional theories rather than modern biology, their careful attention to observation and experience helped create one of the world's oldest medical traditions. Cleanliness and diet were also considered important to maintaining health. Families prepared foods according to seasonal availability and often believed that certain ingredients strengthened the body or restored balance during particular illnesses. Soups, herbal broths, and carefully prepared grains were common remedies for weakness or recovery. At the same time, medical care was not always easily accessible for the poor. Skilled physicians often lived in towns or cities, meaning that rural families sometimes relied on local knowledge, home remedies, or advice passed down within the community. Childbirth was another central moment in household life, and it carried both hope and risk. Without modern medical care, childbirth could be dangerous for both mother and infant. Midwives and experienced women within the community often guided the process, relying on traditional techniques and practical knowledge learned through experience. When a child survived the early months of life, families often marked the occasion with small ceremonies or celebrations. These events were not only joyful but also meaningful expressions of gratitude and continuity, since every new child represented the future of the family line. Childhood itself looked very different from modern expectations. From an early age, children were expected to learn practical responsibilities. Boys often accompanied their fathers to fields or workshops, gradually learning the skills needed to support the household. Girls learned tasks associated with managing the home, including cooking, weaving, and caring for younger siblings. While this work could be demanding, it also served as the primary form of education for most families. Skills were not taught in formal classrooms, but absorbed through daily participation in the rhythms of family life. At the same time, stories, proverbs, and moral lessons were woven into childhood upbringing. Elders often shared tales that reinforced values such as honesty, diligence, loyalty, and respect. These teachings were not presented as abstract philosophy, but as practical guidance for navigating everyday relationships. By learning these lessons early, children grew into adults who understood their place within the social structure of family and community. Even the design of homes reflected the importance of order and balance in daily living. Traditional houses, especially in wealthier households, were often arranged around a central courtyard. This layout created a private, protected space where family members could gather, work, and carry out domestic rituals. Rooms were arranged according to hierarchy within the family, with the most honored positions often reserved for elders or the head of the household. In smaller rural homes, space was more limited, but similar principles of organization still guided how people arranged sleeping areas, storage, and cooking spaces. Lighting inside homes usually came from oil lamps or simple candles, which meant evenings were relatively dim compared with modern life. As darkness settled after sunset, activities gradually slowed. Families might finish simple tasks, share a quiet meal, or prepare for the next day's labor. Without electric light extending the day far into the night, sleep often came earlier, allowing people to rise again with the morning sun. Through these routines, caring for health, raising children, maintaining homes, and passing on traditions, ancient Chinese families created a stable foundation for society. Another dimension of daily life in ancient China was the relationship between ordinary people and the natural environment around them. For most families, nature was not simply scenery or background. It was an active presence that shaped survival, belief, and the rhythm of every season. Farmers depended on predictable weather, fertile soil, and stable rivers. Yet nature could also be unpredictable. Droughts, floods, harsh winters, and crop diseases could disrupt an entire community in a single year. Because of this, people developed a deep awareness of seasonal cycles. Planting, harvesting, storing food, repairing tools, and preparing clothing were all carefully timed according to the agricultural calendar. Knowledge of the land was passed down across generations. Farmers learned which fields held moisture longer, which crops survived particular conditions, and how to read signs in the sky or soil that suggested coming changes in weather. This knowledge was practical, but it also carried cultural meaning. Harmony between humans and nature was seen as essential to maintaining balance in the world. This idea of harmony was reflected in many philosophical traditions that shaped Chinese thought. Taoist teachings, for example, emphasized the importance of living in accordance with natural patterns rather than forcing the world to bend to human will. While these philosophical ideas were often discussed among scholars, their basic spirit also resonated with rural life. Farmers understood that success rarely came from domination of nature, but from patience, observation, and cooperation with natural rhythms. Forests, mountains, and rivers also held spiritual significance. Many communities believed that certain landscapes were connected to protective spirits or sacred forces. Local temples and shrines could be built near mountains, springs, or ancient trees believed to hold spiritual importance. People might visit these places to offer prayers for rain, protection, or good harvests. Even individuals who did not formally belong to organized religious traditions often participated in these rituals because they were woven deeply into community life. Travelers moving through the countryside frequently described the striking variety of China's landscapes. In the north, wide plains and river valleys supported large grain farms. In the south, warmer climates allowed the cultivation of rice in flooded fields, sometimes arranged in carefully built terraces along hillsides. These rice terraces required remarkable effort to construct and maintain, yet they allowed communities to farm land that might otherwise have been unusable. Each region developed agricultural techniques suited to its own geography. Wildlife also played a role in everyday experience. Farmers raised domesticated animals such as pigs, chickens, ducks, and occasionally cattle or water buffalo. Depending on the region, these animals provided food, labor, and materials. Chickens produced eggs, pigs could eventually supply meat, and oxen or buffalo helped pull plows through heavy soil. At the same time, wild animals could threaten crops or livestock, requiring vigilance from farmers trying to protect their limited resources. Fuel for cooking and heating was another constant concern. Many households relied on gathered wood, dried plants, or agricultural byproducts as fuel. Children and adults alike might spend time collecting sticks, brush, or other materials that could be burned in household stoves. In areas where forests were limited, people had to use these resources carefully to ensure that supplies lasted through colder seasons. The natural world also influenced architecture and settlement patterns. Villages were often built in locations that balanced access to water with protection from flooding. Houses were positioned to take advantage of sunlight while avoiding harsh winds when possible. In some regions, surrounding walls or clustered building patterns offered protection not only from weather but also from bandits or wild animals. Despite the many challenges nature presented, it also offered moments of beauty and reflection that became deeply embedded in Chinese cultural traditions. Scholars and poets often wrote about landscapes, mountains, flowing rivers, and quiet gardens. Paintings frequently depicted mist-covered hills or winding paths through forests, reflecting an appreciation for the balance between human life and the natural world. Even for ordinary villagers who never wrote poetry, these landscapes were part of daily experience. Walking to fields at sunrise, hearing birds in the early morning, watching mist rise from rivers, or seeing the colors of changing seasons were all small but meaningful parts of life. Over centuries, these shared experiences created a cultural identity that valued patience, balance, and continuity. In this way, the environment was never separate from ancient Chinese daily life. It shaped agriculture, influenced belief systems, guided settlement, and inspired artistic traditions. Most importantly, it reminded people that their lives were part of a larger cycle that extended far beyond any single generation. The land had supported their ancestors, and with careful stewardship, it would continue to support those who came after them. As evening approached in ancient Chinese towns and villages, daily life gradually shifted into a quieter rhythm. After long hours of labor in fields, workshops, or markets, families returned to their homes carrying the small concerns and achievements of the day. The evening meal often became one of the few moments when family members gathered together. Though meals were usually simple, the act of eating together carried importance beyond nourishment. It reinforced the structure of the household and reminded each member of their place within the family order. In many homes, elders were served first or given the most respected seating position. This custom reflected the deeply rooted belief that age deserved honor. Conversations during these meals could involve practical matters, plans for the next day's work, discussion of harvest conditions, or concerns about taxes and weather. At other times, elders might share stories from the past, family history, or moral lessons that younger members were expected to remember. Through these quiet conversations, knowledge passed naturally between generations. Once the meal ended, households often turned to smaller tasks that could be done indoors. Clothing might be repaired, tools cleaned, baskets woven, or grain sorted for storage. Oil lamps provided limited light, so work was usually modest and careful. The glow from these lamps created a dim but warm atmosphere in homes built from earth, wood, and clay. Shadows moved across the walls while the sounds of distant animals or wind through trees reminded people that the outside world had grown dark. In larger towns, the evening sometimes carried a different feeling. Streets that had been busy with trade during daylight hours slowly emptied, but certain areas remained active. Travelers arriving late might search for an inn, merchants might complete the final sales of the day, and tea houses or small gathering places sometimes hosted quiet conversations among friends or colleagues. Storytellers and musicians could occasionally entertain audiences, especially in prosperous cities where people had a little more time for leisure. Nighttime also brought a measure of caution. Without modern lighting or organized policing, moving through streets after dark could be uncertain. City gates were often closed at specific hours, and watchmen might patrol certain areas to maintain order. For villagers, darkness usually meant retreating fully into the household space. Doors were secured, animals were checked, and families prepared for rest. Sleep itself followed a natural rhythm closely tied to daylight. Without artificial light extending the evening hours, most people went to bed relatively early. Bedding was simple, woven mats, blankets, or padded quilts depending on the season and the family's means. Winters in northern regions could be especially cold, so families relied on thick bedding or heated platforms, sometimes known as Kong beds, which circulated warmth from nearby stoves beneath the sleeping surface. Yet even during rest, the household remained connected to deeper cultural traditions. Before sleeping, some families offered quiet prayers or gestures of respect at a small ancestor shrine within the home. These acts were not dramatic ceremonies, but simple acknowledgments of the continuing presence of past generations. The belief that ancestors watched over the family created a sense of moral guidance even during ordinary moments. Dreams and nighttime experiences also carried cultural meaning. In traditional thought, dreams could sometimes be interpreted as messages or reflections of emotional balance. While not every dream was taken seriously, people often viewed the sleeping mind as connected to unseen forces that influenced human life. By the time the village or town settled into silence, the cycle of daily life had completed another turn. The tasks of the day, planting crops, weaving cloth, trading goods, preparing meals, raising children, might seem small when viewed individually, Yet when repeated across thousands of communities and countless years, these routines formed the foundation of a remarkably enduring civilization. Ancient China did not sustain itself solely through the actions of emperors or generals. It endured because millions of ordinary people maintained households, respected traditions, and worked patiently within the natural cycles of the world around them. Each sunrise began the same quiet process again. Fields were tended, food prepared, tools repaired, and children taught the values expected of them. Through these steady rhythms of work, family, belief, and rest, daily life in ancient China created something powerful: continuity. Generation after generation inherited the same patterns of responsibility and knowledge. Even when dynasties changed or political struggles reshaped the empire, the routines inside homes and villages continued with remarkable consistency. And it was within these quiet routines, far from the imperial courts, that the true strength of ancient Chinese civilization was sustained. Over the course of centuries, these daily routines gradually shaped a cultural identity that extended across vast regions and countless communities. Even though ancient China included many languages, landscapes, and local traditions, the shared structure of everyday life helped create a recognizable sense of unity. The rhythms of family obligation, seasonal farming, respect for elders, and reverence for ancestors formed a kind of cultural thread connecting distant villages and cities to one another. One of the most powerful forces reinforcing this unity was the written language. Although spoken dialects varied widely from region to region, the Chinese writing system allowed educated individuals from different areas to communicate through shared characters. This written tradition preserved laws, histories, poetry, philosophical texts, and practical instructions that could circulate far beyond their place of origin. For scholars and officials, writing was not simply a technical skill but a gateway into the deeper traditions of Chinese civilization. Texts such as historical records, moral teachings, and classical literature helped define what it meant to live properly within society. Students who studied these writings learned not only how to write but also how to think about duty, leadership, and ethical behavior. These ideas gradually influenced how local officials governed communities and how families educated their children. Even villagers who could not read often heard the influence of these teachings through local teachers, elders, or government proclamations. Festivals and shared traditions also strengthened the sense of belonging to a larger cultural world. Throughout the year, communities observed celebrations tied to seasonal changes, agricultural milestones, and ancestral remembrance. The Lunar New Year, for example, was one of the most significant events in the calendar. Families cleaned their homes, prepared special foods, honored ancestors, and welcomed the arrival of a new cycle of time. These traditions were both practical and symbolic, encouraging renewal, gratitude, and hope for the year ahead. Other festivals celebrated the harvest, honored the moon, or remembered historical legends that had become part of collective memory. During these times, Villages that usually focused on labor allowed space for gathering, music, ritual, and shared meals. These celebrations reminded people that their individual struggles and successes were part of a broader human experience shared with neighbors and ancestors alike. At the same time, change was always present beneath the surface of daily life. New technologies gradually altered how people worked and traveled. The development of improved iron tools, better plows, and expanded irrigation systems increased agricultural productivity in many regions. The spread of paper eventually transformed how information was recorded and shared. Innovations in transportation and trade opened new connections between distant areas. These developments did not appear suddenly but unfolded slowly across generations. A village might adopt a new farming method learned from travelers or neighboring communities. A craftsman might refine techniques passed down from earlier artisans. A scholar might introduce new interpretations of ancient texts that influenced local teaching. Over time, these small adjustments accumulated, shaping the gradual evolution of society. Despite these changes, the central structure of family life remained remarkably stable. The household continued to serve as the basic unit of society. Decisions about work, marriage, education, and inheritance were usually made with the well-being of the family in mind rather than the ambitions of a single individual. This emphasis on collective responsibility helped communities maintain stability even during periods of political uncertainty. When dynasties changed or wars disrupted the empire, it was often the strength of these family and village networks that allowed daily life to recover. Fields were replanted, homes repaired, and traditions restored. In this way, the deeper foundations of Chinese civilization proved resilient. The structures that supported daily life, family loyalty, agricultural knowledge, moral teaching, and community cooperation, continued functioning even when governments faltered. Looking back across the long arc of ancient Chinese history, it becomes clear that the empire's endurance was not simply the result of powerful rulers or impressive monuments. Its true strength lay in the millions of ordinary lives that quietly sustained it. Every farmer guiding a plow, every mother preparing food, every craftsman shaping tools, and every teacher guiding a student contributed to a system that valued continuity over sudden change. These countless small acts formed the invisible architecture of civilization. They created stability across centuries and allowed Chinese culture to preserve its identity through cycles of rise and decline. And perhaps that is the most remarkable aspect of ancient Chinese daily life. Although individual lives were often humble and demanding, together they built one of the longest and most enduring cultural traditions in human history. As centuries passed, the routines of daily life also shaped how people understood time itself. In ancient China, time was not only measured through days and seasons, but through cycles that connected human life with the heavens. Astronomers and scholars carefully observed the movement of the sun, moon, and stars, developing calendars that helped determine when crops should be planted, when festivals should be held, and when important rituals should take place. These calendars were more than practical tools. They reflected the belief that harmony between heaven, earth, and human society was essential for stability. The emperor himself was believed to play a role in maintaining this cosmic balance. In theory, the ruler governed under what later thinkers described as the mandate of heaven. If the emperor ruled wisely and justly, harmony would prevail and the natural world would remain orderly. But if rulers became corrupt or careless, disasters such as floods, droughts, or famine might be interpreted as signs that heaven's favor had been withdrawn. While ordinary villagers rarely discussed political philosophy in these terms, they still felt the consequences of this belief system. Good governance meant fair taxes, stable food supplies, and fewer disruptions to daily life. Local communities also organized themselves through forms of cooperation that made survival easier. Neighbors often helped one another during demanding agricultural periods such as planting and harvest. Shared labor could make it possible to finish large tasks more quickly, particularly when weather conditions threatened the success of crops. These cooperative efforts strengthened bonds between families and created informal networks of support. When illness struck a household or a poor harvest left a family struggling, neighbors sometimes provided assistance through shared grain, labor, or advice. Village leadership usually rested with respected elders or locally influential families. These figures helped settle disputes, organize communal projects, and communicate with government officials when necessary. While their authority was not always formalized, their role in maintaining order was widely recognized. Their experience, age, and reputation gave them credibility within the community. In this way, leadership often emerged from practical trust rather than distant political appointment. Education and moral instruction also continued quietly within these village structures. Parents and elders taught children not only practical skills but also the values that shape social harmony. Respect for parents, loyalty to family, honesty in trade, and diligence in work were emphasized repeatedly. These teachings were reinforced through proverbs, stories, and examples drawn from history or legend. In many cases, the most powerful lessons were not spoken in formal lectures but demonstrated through daily behavior. Over time, these values became deeply embedded within cultural expectations. A person who neglected family duties or acted dishonestly could lose the trust of the community, which might be far more damaging than any formal punishment. Reputation mattered greatly in small communities where everyone depended on one another. Maintaining harmony and avoiding unnecessary conflict became essential for preserving social stability. Even death did not end a person's connection to the community. Funeral rituals were among the most carefully observed traditions in ancient Chinese life. Families organized respectful burials designed to honor the deceased and ensure that their spirit could rest peacefully. Offerings of food, incense, and symbolic objects were sometimes placed near graves or ancestral tablets. Mourning periods allowed relatives to express grief while demonstrating respect for the person who had passed away. These practices reinforced the belief that the living and the dead remained connected. Ancestors were not forgotten figures from the past but active members of the family's moral world. Their memory encouraged the living to behave with dignity and responsibility, knowing that their own actions would one day become part of the family legacy. Across generations, these customs created a sense of continuity that stretched far beyond any single lifetime. Children grew up learning that they were part of a long chain of ancestors and descendants. Their work, choices, and conduct would influence not only their own future but also the well-being of those who came after them. In this way, daily life in ancient China was never purely individual. It was woven into a larger fabric of family, community, and tradition. Every act, planting a field, honoring an ancestor, teaching a child, or helping a neighbor, contributed to maintaining the balance that allowed society to endure. And while the grand narratives of history often focus on dynasties, wars, and political change, the quiet persistence of these everyday practices tells a deeper story. The stability of ancient Chinese civilization rested not only on powerful rulers, but on millions of ordinary people who carried forward traditions of cooperation, respect, and responsibility. Through their daily lives, they ensured that the culture surrounding them would continue, steady and recognizable, across the long passage of time. Over the long span of ancient Chinese history, another quiet but meaningful part of daily life involved the relationship between people and learning, even for those who were not formally educated. Knowledge in ancient China did not exist only in schools or among scholars. Much of it lived within families, trades, and local traditions. Skills were remembered, repeated, and improved through generations, becoming part of the collective memory of a community. A farmer, for example, might never read a classical text, yet he possessed a deep understanding of soil, seasons, and crop behavior that had been refined through years of observation. He knew when the earth felt ready for planting, how the smell of rain in the air hinted at an approaching storm, and how subtle differences in color could reveal whether a crop was healthy or struggling. This knowledge was rarely written down, but it was highly respected within the community because it directly affected survival. Artisans held a similar form of practical wisdom. A potter could judge the quality of clay simply by touching it. A carpenter understood the strength and flexibility of different woods and knew which types were best suited for beams, doors, or furniture. A blacksmith recognized the changing color of heated metal and could shape tools with remarkable precision. These crafts required patience and years of experience, and they were often passed from master to apprentice within families. Learning in these environments happened through observation and imitation rather than formal instruction. A young apprentice might spend years watching an experienced craftsman before being allowed to perform important tasks independently. Mistakes were corrected through guidance and repetition, gradually building confidence and skill. Over time, these practical forms of education helped maintain a stable economy in which essential goods could be produced locally. In wealthier households or towns with access to teachers, a different type of learning developed. Students studying classical texts often spent long hours memorizing passages that described moral conduct, good governance, and historical examples of wise leadership. Education was demanding, requiring discipline and dedication. Students practiced writing characters carefully, sometimes copying the same text again and again until their handwriting became precise. The ability to write well was highly valued because it demonstrated both intelligence and self-control. For scholars seeking positions in government, mastery of classical literature and philosophy became an important step toward public service. Although only a small percentage of the population pursued this path, the influence of educated officials shaped many aspects of society. Their interpretations of law, ritual, and moral philosophy influenced how communities were governed and how disputes were resolved. In villages and towns, storytelling also played a significant role in preserving knowledge. Travelers, merchants, and elders often shared stories about historical figures, moral lessons, and unusual events from distant places. These stories could be told during quiet evenings or during festivals when people gathered to celebrate. Through storytelling, people learned about the past and about the values that society expected them to uphold. Many of these stories highlighted themes of loyalty, honesty, perseverance, and respect for family. Heroes were often admired not only for bravery but for their sense of duty and integrity. These narratives reinforced the cultural ideals that guided everyday behavior, making history and morality part of the shared imagination of the community. Libraries and written archives existed in larger cities, especially within government offices or scholarly institutions. These collections preserved important documents such as historical records, legal codes, philosophical writings, and scientific observations. Scholars who had access to these materials could study the achievements of earlier generations and contribute new interpretations or discoveries. At the same time, knowledge continued to expand through practical innovation. Farmers experimented with new planting methods. Engineers designed improved irrigation systems. Physicians recorded new treatments for illness. Artisans refined techniques that improved the durability and beauty of their creations. Although these changes often appeared slowly, they gradually improved the quality of life across many regions. The result was a society where learning existed in many forms at once. Formal scholarship influenced government and philosophy, while practical knowledge sustained agriculture, craftsmanship, and trade. Together, these layers of understanding helped create a civilization that valued both intellectual reflection and skilled labor. When we look closely at daily life in ancient China, it becomes clear that learning was never limited to classrooms or scholars alone. It lived in the fields, workshops, homes, and marketplaces where ordinary people practiced their trades and shared their experiences. Generation after generation, this quiet exchange of knowledge ensured that skills were preserved, traditions continued, and communities remained capable of adapting to the challenges of their world. Over time, these many layers of daily activity, farming, family life, craftwork, learning, belief, and cooperation, formed a remarkably stable pattern that allowed ancient Chinese society to endure through centuries of change. Empires expanded and contracted, rulers rose and fell, and new ideas entered the culture. Yet the basic structure of everyday life often remained familiar from one generation to the next. This continuity created a sense of permanence that helped communities navigate uncertainty. One reason for this stability was the strong emphasis placed on tradition. In ancient China, the past was not seen as something distant or irrelevant. Instead, it was viewed as a source of wisdom. The actions of earlier generations were carefully studied and remembered because they were believed to contain guidance for present decisions. Families honored their ancestors not only through ritual but through imitation, by trying to live according to the values that those ancestors had embodied. Within the household, this sense of continuity shaped nearly every important decision. Parents thought about how their choices would affect the family's future reputation and stability. Marriages were arranged with careful consideration because they linked two families together across generations. Property, land, and tools were passed down with the expectation that they would continue to support the family long after the current generation had grown old. Land itself carried deep significance. For farming families, the land represented both survival and identity. A field cultivated by grandparents and great-grandparents became more than just a place of work. It became part of the family's history. Even when political changes forced people to move or rebuild their homes, many families tried to maintain connections to the land that had supported them for generations. Community life reinforced these connections. Villages were often made up of families who had lived near one another for decades or even centuries. Over time, neighbors became extended networks of cooperation and familiarity. People knew each other's histories, strengths, and hardships. When large tasks needed to be done, repairing irrigation channels, rebuilding structures after storms, or organizing seasonal festivals, community members often worked together. Festivals in particular provided moments when the pressures of daily labor gave way to shared celebration. Lanterns illuminated village streets. Food was prepared in larger quantities than usual, and music or performances might bring people together in communal spaces. These events were not simply entertainment. They served as reminders that life contains cycles of renewal and joy even in the midst of difficult work. Trade and travel slowly expanded the horizons of many communities as well. Merchants moving along regional routes carried not only goods but also ideas and stories. Through these encounters, people learned about distant places, unfamiliar customs, and new techniques that might eventually influence their own communities. Although many villagers never traveled far themselves, they were still connected to a broader world through these traveling networks. Over long periods of time, this combination of stability and gradual exchange allowed Chinese civilization to grow in both complexity and resilience. New dynasties might introduce reforms or new administrative systems, but the deeper foundations of society, family structure, agricultural life, community cooperation, and moral teaching, continued to function in recognizable ways. What is striking when examining ancient Chinese daily life is how much responsibility rested on ordinary individuals. A farmer waking before dawn, a mother preparing food for the household, a craftsman shaping tools in a small workshop, or a teacher guiding students through classical texts. All of these people were participating in the preservation of a vast cultural system. None of them alone controlled the direction of the empire, yet together they sustained it. In this sense, the true strength of ancient China did not lie only in imperial palaces, grand cities, or powerful armies. It lay in the quiet consistency of everyday actions repeated across millions of homes and communities. These routines, working the land, honoring family, teaching children, and maintaining social harmony, created a foundation strong enough to support centuries of history. And when we look back today, trying to understand how one civilization could endure for so long, the answer often leads us not to the throne room but to the village courtyard, the workshop, the marketplace, and the family table. It was in these ordinary places, through the patient efforts of countless individuals, that the enduring character of ancient Chinese life was quietly built and preserved. As we move toward the quieter edges of ancient Chinese daily life, it becomes clear that routine itself was one of the civilization's greatest stabilizing forces. Life was rarely dramatic for most people. It unfolded in repeated patterns that gradually shaped both personal character and social order. Each day brought familiar responsibilities, and those responsibilities were understood as part of a larger structure that connected the individual to family, community, and empire. Morning often began with the same sequence of actions. Fires were lit in household stoves, water was fetched from wells or nearby streams, and simple meals were prepared before work began. In rural areas, the first sounds of the day might include roosters calling, animals stirring, and tools being gathered for the walk to nearby fields. These early hours carried a quiet sense of purpose. Every member of the household knew the tasks expected of them. For farmers, the path to the fields was often a familiar route walked thousands of times over a lifetime. The same trees, irrigation channels, and distant hills appeared every morning, forming a landscape deeply tied to memory. Fields were carefully divided, sometimes marked by narrow paths or ridges separating one family's land from another. Each section of land required attention, checking the condition of crops, repairing small irrigation channels, or removing weeds that threatened growth. These daily inspections were not rushed. Farmers moved slowly through their fields, observing details that might escape an untrained eye. The color of leaves, the moisture of the soil, or the behavior of insects could all provide information about the health of the crop. Over many years, farmers developed a sensitivity to these small changes, allowing them to respond before problems grew too large. Meanwhile, in towns and cities, the day opened with a different rhythm. Market streets gradually filled with merchants setting up stalls and arranging goods for display. Vendors might spread out baskets of vegetables, bundles of herbs, pottery, fabrics, or small household tools. The sounds of bargaining soon filled the air as customers examined items and negotiated prices. These markets were lively but orderly places, reflecting a society that valued structure even in commerce. Food vendors often played an important role in these spaces. Travelers, laborers, and merchants could purchase simple meals such as steamed grains, soups, dumplings, or small cooked dishes that were prepared fresh each morning. The smell of cooking food drifting through the market streets added to the atmosphere of movement and conversation. For many urban workers, these stalls provided quick nourishment during busy days. Education, where it existed, also followed a disciplined routine. Students studying with a teacher might begin their lessons early in the morning, copying characters and reciting passages from classical texts. The process required patience and repetition. Teachers corrected posture, pronunciation, and writing style with careful attention. Although the lessons could be demanding, they were seen as essential preparation for responsible participation in society. Even in places without formal schools, the discipline of daily work served as a form of education. Young people learned how to manage responsibilities, cooperate with others, and maintain the standards expected by their families. By participating in daily tasks, they gradually absorbed the values that guided community life. As the sun moved higher in the sky, activity across fields, workshops, and markets reached its busiest point. Labor was steady and focused, shaped by the understanding that each day's work contributed to long-term survival. A single afternoon of neglect could damage crops or delay important repairs. Because of this, diligence was widely admired. A hard-working person earned respect not only for productivity but also for demonstrating reliability and responsibility. Yet despite the demanding nature of work, ancient Chinese daily life was not without moments of quiet reflection. Farmers might pause briefly under the shade of a tree. Craftsmen might rest while examining their progress, and merchants might step aside to share tea or conversation with acquaintances. These pauses, though short, helped maintain a sense of balance within the flow of the day. By late afternoon, the intensity of labor gradually eased. Tools were gathered, animals returned to their shelters, and unfinished work was noted for the following morning. In both rural and urban settings, the approach of evening brought a subtle shift in energy. The sounds of the day softened as people prepared to return home. These simple patterns, waking early, working steadily, sharing meals, teaching the young, and resting after sunset, may appear ordinary when viewed individually, but repeated across countless households and centuries, they created the steady rhythm that sustained one of the world's longest continuous civilizations. Through patience, discipline, and shared understanding of responsibility, ordinary people quietly carried forward the traditions that shaped ancient Chinese society. As night settled fully across villages and towns, the world of ancient China entered one of its quietest and most reflective moments. Without modern lights or constant noise, darkness brought a sense of stillness that shaped how people experienced the end of each day. The sky, often clear in rural regions far from dense settlements, revealed bright stars that had guided travelers, farmers, and scholars for generations. These stars were not simply points of light, but part of a larger cosmic pattern that many believed influenced the balance of the world. Inside homes, the evening atmosphere remained gentle and practical. After the final household tasks were completed, family members often gathered for a short time before sleep. Conversations were usually calm, sometimes reflecting on the events of the day or preparing for the responsibilities of tomorrow. In farming communities, these discussions might involve the condition of crops, plans for irrigation, or the timing of the next planting stage. In towns, families might talk about trade, news from the marketplace, or events reported by travelers. These quiet moments allowed families to strengthen their relationships. Children listened to elders, learning not only practical knowledge but also family stories and cultural values. Elders sometimes spoke about earlier generations, recounting how grandparents or great-grandparents had lived, worked, and faced challenges. Through these stories, young listeners came to understand that their own lives were part of a long and continuing lineage. Respect for ancestors remained deeply present in these reflections. Many households kept small shrines or tablets honoring family members who had passed away. These spaces were simple but meaningful, often placed in a respected area of the home. Offering incense or small symbolic gestures before sleep could serve as a quiet reminder of the connection between past and present. The presence of ancestors was not imagined as distant or abstract. Instead, they were viewed as continuing guardians of the family's well-being. Outside the household walls, the village itself grew peaceful. Animals settled into barns or small enclosures, and pathways that had been busy earlier in the day became quiet. Occasionally, a distant sound, perhaps the call of a night bird or the movement of wind through trees, would break the silence. For communities that had spent the entire day working together, this calmness felt natural and reassuring. In cities, nighttime was slightly different but still subdued compared with modern urban life. Certain areas might remain active a little longer, particularly near inns or gathering places where travelers arrived late. Guards or watchmen sometimes moved through streets to maintain order and ensure that city gates and important buildings remained secure. Their presence reflected the need to protect crowded settlements where goods, officials, and merchants were concentrated. Yet even in cities, the absence of bright artificial light meant that nighttime activity remained limited. Most people preferred the safety and warmth of their homes once darkness spread across the streets. Lamps burned only as long as necessary, conserving valuable oil for the following evening. Sleep, when it came, followed the natural rhythm of the environment. People rested deeply because the day's physical labor had often been demanding. Farmers had spent hours walking fields or guiding animals through soil. Craftsmen had stood beside forges or work tables shaping materials into useful objects. Merchants and laborers had carried goods, traveled dusty roads, or spent long hours negotiating trade. Rest was therefore not simply relaxation, it was recovery for the next cycle of work. And that cycle would begin again with the first light of morning. When we look across these daily patterns, morning preparation, midday labor, evening gathering, and nighttime rest, we begin to see how ancient Chinese life functioned as a steady rhythm rather than a sequence of dramatic events. The strength of the civilization emerged from these repeated routines practiced by millions of ordinary people. Each household contributed quietly to the larger stability of society. Parents taught children how to behave, farmers produced food for the population, craftsmen created tools and goods, and communities cooperated to maintain shared resources. Even when dynasties rose and fell, these routines continued with remarkable persistence. This continuity is one of the most striking features of ancient Chinese civilization. While political structures sometimes changed rapidly, the daily habits of ordinary people remained anchored in tradition, family responsibility, and careful attention to the natural world. And so, when we imagine life in ancient China, it is helpful to picture not only emperors and grand monuments, but also the countless homes where quiet routines unfolded each day. In those homes, around cooking fires, in courtyard conversations, and in the fields stretching beyond village walls, the enduring character of Chinese civilization was patiently sustained across generations. Over the years and generations that followed, these quiet patterns of daily life created something deeper than routine. They shaped a worldview, an understanding of how people should live within the broader order of society and the natural world. In ancient China, life was rarely viewed as random or disconnected. Instead, people believed that everything existed within a larger system of relationships. A person belonged to a family, the family belonged to a village or community, and that community ultimately formed part of the empire. This layered structure influenced how people understood responsibility. An individual was not expected to live purely for personal ambition, but to contribute to the stability of the groups they belonged to. A son respected his parents. Parents cared for their children and elders. Farmers produced food that sustained towns and cities. Officials governed communities in the name of the emperor. When each level functioned properly, society was believed to remain balanced. Because of this belief, personal conduct was taken seriously. Everyday behavior, how someone spoke to neighbors, how honestly a merchant traded goods, or how faithfully a person fulfilled obligations, was often seen as part of maintaining social harmony. Even small actions mattered. If trust weakened between neighbors or family members, the effects could ripple outward through the community. Reputation, therefore, held great importance. In small villages where people lived close together for many years, everyone was aware of one another's habits and character. A person known for fairness and reliability might gain respect and influence within the community. On the other hand, someone who behaved dishonestly or irresponsibly could quickly lose trust. This social awareness acted as a form of informal regulation, encouraging people to maintain honorable conduct even without direct supervision. Trade relationships also depended heavily on reputation. Merchants traveling between regions often relied on trust built over time. Regular customers returned to sellers whose goods were reliable and whose prices were considered fair. These networks of trust allowed commerce to expand gradually, connecting distant regions of the empire through long chains of exchange. At the same time, the world outside each community could feel vast and mysterious. Travelers returning from distant provinces described unfamiliar landscapes, foreign customs, and bustling cities larger than anything villagers had seen. Such stories broadened the imagination of listeners, reminding them that their small corner of the world was part of a much larger civilization. Yet despite these connections, most people lived their entire lives within a relatively small geographic area. The fields they cultivated, the wells they used for water, and the temples where they offered prayers often remained constant throughout their lives. Over time, these familiar places became deeply tied to personal memory. Paths worn into the ground by countless footsteps reflected generations of daily movement between home, fields, and market. Nature continued to provide both beauty and challenge throughout these lives. A gentle spring rain could bring relief and hope for a successful harvest, while an unexpected drought might fill an entire village with anxiety. People watched the skies carefully, interpreting changes in wind, cloud patterns, and temperature as signs of what might come. This close observation strengthened the connection between human life and the environment. Seasons therefore became markers of time not only for agriculture but for emotional experience as well. Spring carried anticipation as fields were planted and the world began to grow again. Summer demanded endurance through long days of work beneath the sun. Autumn brought both satisfaction and worry as harvests determined whether families would have enough to survive the winter. Winter offered a quieter period when the land rested and families turned inward to household tasks and reflection. Within these cycles, people measured their lives in harvests, festivals, and family milestones rather than in precise numerical years. A person might remember events by saying they happened 3 harvests ago, or during the winter when the river froze deeply. This way of marking time reflected how closely daily existence remained tied to the rhythms of nature. Over many centuries, these patterns of work, belief, and social responsibility helped create a culture that valued endurance and balance. Even when political change disrupted the empire, the habits practiced in households and villages continued almost unchanged. Farmers still planted crops, families still honored ancestors, and communities still gathered during festivals to celebrate the passing of seasons. And in that quiet persistence lies the real story of ancient Chinese daily life. It was not defined by dramatic moments but by steady repetition, millions of ordinary actions performed by ordinary people who understood their place within a much larger order. Through these actions, day after day and generation after generation, They preserved the cultural foundations of one of the longest-lasting civilizations in human history. As generations passed, the quiet routines of ancient Chinese life slowly became traditions that shaped the identity of entire communities. People did not simply perform tasks out of necessity. They performed them because those tasks had always been done that way. Customs surrounding planting, cooking, marriage, mourning, and celebration carried layers of meaning that stretched far back into the past. Each generation inherited these patterns, adjusted them slightly to their circumstances, and then passed them forward again. One of the clearest places this continuity appeared was in the structure of the extended family. In many households, several generations lived under the same roof or within the same courtyard compound. Grandparents, parents, children, and sometimes even more distant relatives shared responsibilities for maintaining the household. This arrangement created a sense of stability because knowledge and authority did not disappear when individuals aged. Elders continued to guide the family with their experience, while younger members contributed physical labor and energy. The presence of elders also helped maintain cultural memory. They remembered earlier harvests, old disputes between families, and the ways previous generations had solved problems during difficult times. When a younger farmer faced uncertainty about planting conditions or irrigation repairs, an older relative might recall how similar situations had been handled decades earlier. In this way, experience served as an informal archive of practical knowledge. Family ceremonies reinforced these bonds. Weddings, for instance, were not only unions between two individuals but alliances between two families. Preparations could involve careful planning, exchange of gifts, and rituals that honored both ancestral lines. These ceremonies reminded everyone present that marriage carried responsibilities extending far beyond personal relationships. It ensured the continuation of the family lineage and strengthened connections between households. Births were greeted with similar importance. When a child entered the world, the entire family often shared in the sense of renewal and responsibility. The child represented both hope and continuity, another link in the long chain connecting past generations to those still to come. Parents and grandparents worked together to guide the child's upbringing, gradually teaching the customs and expectations that shaped proper behavior. Even the organization of space within the household reflected this cultural order. In traditional courtyard homes, rooms were arranged according to family hierarchy. The most respected positions were often reserved for the elders or the head of the household. Younger members occupied other areas, reflecting their place within the family structure. These arrangements quietly reinforced the values of respect and responsibility that govern social relationships. Beyond the household walls, community cooperation remained equally important. Villagers often relied on one another during demanding agricultural periods or when natural challenges threatened their survival. If heavy rains damaged irrigation channels, neighbors might gather to repair them together. When storms damaged homes or storage buildings, assistance from nearby families could make recovery possible. Shared labor also appeared during large construction tasks. Building bridges, clearing pathways, or strengthening flood barriers required more effort than a single household could provide. Community participation made these projects achievable while also strengthening social bonds. Working side by side allowed neighbors to build trust and mutual understanding. Markets and trade routes continued to link villages with broader economic networks. Merchants traveling from town to town carried salt, cloth, metal tools, and other goods that rural communities could not easily produce themselves. These traders also brought news, stories of political changes, distant wars, or new inventions appearing in other regions. Through such exchanges, even remote villages maintained a connection to the wider world. Despite these connections, the daily lives of most people remained rooted in familiar landscapes. A farmer might spend an entire lifetime working fields that his ancestors had cultivated before him. The same hills, rivers, and pathways appeared each day, gradually becoming part of personal identity. These landscapes held memories of childhood, family gatherings, and seasons of both abundance and hardship. Over time, these memories blended into a larger cultural understanding of endurance. Ancient Chinese society valued patience and perseverance because survival often required steady effort rather than sudden change. Fields needed years of careful cultivation. Children required many seasons of guidance before becoming responsible adults. Communities strengthened gradually through cooperation and shared experience. When historians today attempt to understand the longevity of Chinese civilization, they often look at dynasties, political systems, or major inventions. Yet beneath those visible achievements lay the quieter story of ordinary life. The routines practiced within households and villages, planting crops, honoring elders, teaching children, and maintaining harmony, created the stable foundation upon which the entire civilization rested. In the end, the story of ancient Chinese daily life is a story of continuity. It shows how millions of individuals, living modest lives far from imperial courts, collectively sustained a culture that endured for thousands of years. Through their patience, discipline, and respect for tradition, they ensured that the rhythms of their world continued long after their own lifetimes had passed in the later centuries of ancient China. These long-established rhythms of daily life continued to adapt quietly as society grew larger and more interconnected. New cities expanded along rivers and trade routes, drawing farmers, craftsmen, scholars, and merchants into more complex communities. Yet even in these growing urban environments, the foundations of daily life still rested on the same familiar principles: family responsibility, respect for tradition, and steady labor. Cities introduced a wider range of occupations than rural villages. In addition to craftsmen and merchants, urban centers supported scribes, book copyists, teachers, entertainers, herbal doctors, transport workers, and many forms of specialized labor. Each profession contributed to the functioning of the city, much like the different roles within a village household. While the environment was more crowded and dynamic, the underlying expectation remained the same. Individuals were expected to fulfill their responsibilities with discipline and reliability. Urban neighborhoods often developed strong local identities. Families living in the same street or district came to know one another well, forming small social networks similar to village communities. These neighborhoods shared wells, markets, and temples where residents gathered for religious observances or festivals. Even in large cities, this sense of localized familiarity helped maintain social order. Markets in particular served as the heart of city life. Every morning, merchants arranged goods brought from surrounding regions: fresh vegetables, grains, dried fish, fruits, cloth, metal tools, ceramics, and medicinal herbs. The variety of goods available in these markets reflected the growing complexity of the economy. Farmers transported produce from nearby fields, while traders arriving from distant provinces introduced unfamiliar items that broadened local diets and customs. The atmosphere of these markets was lively but structured. Officials sometimes regulated trading areas, ensuring that merchants paid proper taxes and maintained fair practices. Standardized weights and measures helped prevent disputes over quantity and price. This level of organization allowed markets to operate efficiently while maintaining trust between buyers and sellers. Food culture also became more varied in urban settings. Street vendors and small kitchens prepared meals that workers and travelers could purchase quickly during the day. Steamed buns, noodle dishes, soups, rice meals, and various dumplings became common features of daily urban dining. While rural households mostly ate food produced from their own land, city residents relied heavily on these market systems for their daily meals. Education and literacy grew increasingly visible in cities as well. Schools and private tutors taught children from families who could afford formal instruction. Students studied classical texts, calligraphy, history, and moral philosophy. The discipline required to master written characters remained intense, and students often practiced writing for many hours each day. For those who succeeded in their studies, education could lead to positions within the government bureaucracy. Officials were responsible for maintaining law, collecting taxes, and managing public works projects such as canals, roads, and granaries. These administrative systems allowed the empire to coordinate resources across vast distances. While ordinary villagers rarely saw the highest officials, they still felt the effects of their policies through taxation, infrastructure, and local governance. Religious life in cities was equally diverse. Temples dedicated to various deities stood alongside shrines honoring ancestors and historical heroes. Monks, priests, and spiritual teachers offered guidance, rituals, and philosophical instruction to those seeking comfort or understanding. Festivals held at these temples drew large crowds, filling streets with lanterns, music, and ceremonial offerings. Despite the busier pace of city life, many traditions remained unchanged from earlier centuries. Families continued to gather for important celebrations such as weddings, harvest festivals, and the Lunar New Year. ancestral tablets remained central to household rituals. Respect for elders and loyalty to family obligations still shaped daily decisions. Even leisure activities reflected cultural continuity. Board games, poetry gatherings, music performances, and storytelling sessions provided opportunities for relaxation while reinforcing shared cultural values. Scholars sometimes met to compose poetry or discuss philosophy, while ordinary workers might gather to watch traveling performers or listen to local musicians. As evening approached in these cities, activity gradually slowed. Market stalls closed, goods were stored, and residents returned to their homes. Lanterns illuminated narrow streets as families prepared evening meals and shared conversation. Though the environment was busier than a quiet village, the closing rhythm of the day felt familiar across both rural and urban settings. What becomes clear when observing these patterns is that ancient Chinese daily life was shaped by both continuity and adaptation. The empire changed, technology advanced, and cities expanded, but the core values of family, duty, and harmony remained steady. Through countless small actions repeated every day, working fields, crafting goods, teaching children, trading in markets, honoring ancestors, ordinary people sustained the cultural foundations of their world. These quiet routines allowed ancient Chinese civilization not only to survive but to flourish across centuries, creating a legacy that still influences society today. As we look even more closely at the everyday world of ancient China, it becomes clear that daily life was not only about work and survival, but also about maintaining balance between effort and rest, order and flexibility, tradition and small changes. People lived within systems that had existed for generations, yet those systems quietly adapted as communities encountered new ideas, tools, and experiences. One important element of daily life was the way knowledge moved through society in small, practical ways. A farmer might learn a new irrigation method from a neighboring village. A merchant might bring unfamiliar spices or fabrics from a distant region. A craftsman might refine a tool design that made work slightly easier. None of these changes appeared dramatic on their own, but over time they slowly improved living conditions and expanded what communities could accomplish. Agriculture continued to sit at the center of this process. For most families, farming was not only their occupation but their entire economic foundation. Land provided food, and food provided stability. Because of this, agricultural knowledge was treated with great seriousness. Families studied the patterns of rainfall, river flow, and soil fertility across decades. They experimented with crop rotation, different planting methods, and improved storage systems that protected grain from spoilage. Rice cultivation in southern China, for example, required remarkable coordination and care. Terraced fields carved into hillsides captured water and sunlight, allowing farmers to grow rice in places where flat land was limited. These terraces represented years of labor and careful engineering. Maintaining them required cooperation among neighbors, since water had to be shared and distributed evenly across fields. Meanwhile, in northern regions, wheat and millet farming shaped a different set of routines. Farmers there often dealt with colder winters and drier conditions. Their tools, planting schedules, and crop choices reflected the unique challenges of their environment. Over centuries, these regional differences created distinct agricultural traditions while still fitting into the broader framework of Chinese society. Food preparation inside the household reflected these regional patterns as well. In the north, steamed buns and wheat noodles became common staples, while rice dominated the diet of the south. Vegetables, beans, fermented sauces, and preserved foods added variety. Families also developed many techniques for storing food so that supplies could last through winter or periods of scarcity. Cooking itself was an important household responsibility that required both skill and efficiency. Fuel for stoves, often wood, charcoal, or dried plant material, was valuable, so meals were prepared carefully to conserve heat. Clay pots, iron woks in later periods, and bamboo steamers allowed cooks to create nourishing meals using relatively simple ingredients. Children growing up in these households absorbed these culinary traditions naturally. Watching parents and grandparents cook, they learned which ingredients worked well together and how meals should be balanced. In this way, food became another form of cultural memory passed quietly between generations. Another steady presence in daily life was the network of local markets that linked villages and towns together. Even families that produced most of their own food still relied on markets for certain goods: salt, metal tools, cloth, pottery, and sometimes livestock. Market days often brought people together from surrounding villages, creating temporary gatherings where trade mixed with social interaction. These gatherings were lively but purposeful. Farmers brought baskets of vegetables or grains to sell. Artisans displayed tools, pottery, or woven goods. Merchants traveled between markets carrying products from distant regions. Through these exchanges, communities gained access to materials and information that might otherwise remain beyond their reach. Markets also served as informal meeting places where people shared news about political changes, natural disasters, or economic conditions in neighboring regions. Even individuals who rarely traveled far from home could hear stories about distant provinces, new trade routes, or unusual events occurring elsewhere in the empire. Through all these activities, farming, cooking, trading, learning, ancient Chinese society maintained a delicate balance between tradition and adaptation. Customs provided stability, while practical knowledge allowed communities to respond to changing conditions. And perhaps that is what makes ancient Chinese daily life so remarkable. It was not defined by sudden transformations, but by the steady accumulation of experience. Generation after generation, people observed their environment, refined their practices, and preserved the lessons that allowed their communities to endure. In the quiet routines of fields, kitchens, workshops, and marketplaces, millions of individuals contributed to a civilization that would last for thousands of years. Their lives may have seemed ordinary in their own time, yet together they created one of the most enduring cultural foundations in human history. As we continue exploring the quiet rhythms of ancient Chinese daily life, it becomes clear that community relationships were just as essential as family life. No household existed entirely on its own. Villages and neighborhoods formed networks of mutual reliance, where cooperation was often necessary for survival. Fields needed irrigation systems that crossed property lines, roads required maintenance, and harvest seasons demanded coordinated effort. Because of this, neighbors frequently worked together in ways that strengthened social bonds. In rural villages, these relationships developed naturally over many years. Families lived close to one another, often sharing similar challenges and seasonal responsibilities. When planting season arrived, the entire community felt the pressure of time. If heavy rain threatened the harvest or a canal needed repair, villagers might gather collectively to solve the problem. This cooperation was not always formally organized, but it was widely understood that helping neighbors today might ensure help in return tomorrow. Festivals and seasonal ceremonies provided important opportunities for communities to come together outside of work. These events often marked changes in the agricultural calendar or honored local traditions that had been practiced for generations. During festivals, villages decorated shared spaces with lanterns or banners, prepared special foods, and participated in music or simple performances. Even families struggling through difficult seasons often tried to participate, because these gatherings strengthened the sense of belonging within the community. Food played a central role during these celebrations. While daily meals were usually modest, festival meals could include dishes prepared with greater care and variety. Families might contribute ingredients or share cooking responsibilities. Preparing food together reinforced relationships between neighbors while creating memories that lasted long after the celebration ended. Markets also served as social centers where community life extended beyond the boundaries of a single village. Market days brought together farmers, traders, craftsmen, and travelers who exchanged goods and news. These markets were often filled with conversation as people discussed crop conditions, family events, and developments in nearby regions. For many individuals, these gatherings were one of the few chances to interact with people outside their immediate village. Through these interactions, information traveled surprisingly far. A merchant passing through might share stories about distant cities, new tools, or political decisions made by officials. Travelers could describe unfamiliar landscapes or customs from regions hundreds of miles away. Even if villagers never saw these places themselves, the stories expanded their understanding of the wider world beyond their fields. Religion and spiritual practice also reinforced community connections. Local temples often served as gathering places where residents came together for rituals, prayers, and seasonal ceremonies. These temples were not only spiritual centers but also social spaces where people met neighbors, exchanged ideas, and participated in shared traditions. Temple festivals could be particularly lively. Musicians, storytellers, and performers sometimes appeared during these celebrations, attracting visitors from nearby villages. Stalls selling food, handmade goods, and small offerings created an atmosphere that combined religious devotion with communal enjoyment. For many people, these events were among the most memorable moments of the year. Despite the warmth of community life, disagreements occasionally arose. Disputes over land boundaries, water usage, or trade agreements could create tension between families. In many cases, village elders or respected community leaders helped resolve these conflicts. Their role was not simply to enforce rules, but to restore harmony. Maintaining peaceful relationships was considered essential for the well-being of the entire village. This emphasis on harmony reflected a broader cultural value deeply rooted in Chinese society. Cooperation and balance were seen as the foundations of stability. When individuals acted responsibly and treated others with respect, the community could function smoothly. When conflicts escalated or selfish behavior disrupted trust, the consequences could affect everyone. Over time, these shared experiences, working together in fields, celebrating festivals, trading in markets, and resolving disputes, created strong emotional ties between community members. Villages became places not only of labor but of shared identity. People recognized themselves as part of a collective history built through generations of cooperation. Looking back, it becomes clear that the strength of ancient Chinese civilization rested heavily on these local communities. While emperors governed from distant capitals and officials administered laws, the real continuity of society depended on villages and neighborhoods functioning effectively. Within these spaces, ordinary people practiced the values that held the broader culture together. Through simple acts of cooperation and shared responsibility, communities created stability that could survive even periods of political change. As we look deeper into the quiet structure of everyday life in ancient China, another important element appears: the slow passage of generations. Unlike modern societies where rapid change can transform lifestyles within decades, ancient Chinese communities often experienced continuity over much longer stretches of time. Children frequently grew up living in the same villages where their parents and grandparents had lived, surrounded by the same fields, pathways, rivers, and buildings that had shaped family life for many years. This continuity created a strong sense of belonging. People did not usually think of themselves as isolated individuals, but as part of an extended lineage that stretched both backward and forward through time. Ancestors were remembered not only during formal rituals, but also in everyday conversation. A field might be known as the place where a grandfather once worked, or a tree might mark the site of an earlier family home. In this way, landscapes themselves carried memories that connected present generations with the past. This connection to ancestry also influenced how families approached responsibility. A household was expected to preserve the reputation and stability established by earlier generations. Maintaining land, managing resources wisely, and raising children with good character were all considered ways of honoring those who had come before. When individuals acted responsibly, they strengthened the standing of their entire family within the community. Children gradually absorbed these expectations as they grew. Their education was not limited to formal instruction but unfolded naturally through daily participation in family life. Boys often joined fathers or older brothers in fields or workshops, learning the physical skills needed to support the household. Girls commonly worked alongside mothers or grandmothers, gaining experience in cooking, weaving, managing supplies, and caring for younger siblings. Through these shared activities, knowledge passed quietly from one generation to the next. Play still existed within childhood, but it was often closely connected to the world around them. Children might play simple games with stones, sticks, or handmade toys. They could imitate adult activities, pretending to farm, trade, or cook. These playful moments allowed them to practice the roles they would eventually take on in adulthood. Even leisure, in this sense, became part of the gradual preparation for responsible life. As children grew older, expectations increased. Teenagers often carried significant responsibilities within the household. A young farmer might already be capable of managing sections of land, guiding animals through fields, or negotiating small exchanges in the local market. A young craft apprentice might spend long hours refining their skills under the supervision of a master. Through these experiences, young people gained confidence while proving their reliability to the community. Marriage marked another major transition in this life cycle. Families typically arranged marriages with careful attention to compatibility, social standing, and practical considerations. A marriage was rarely viewed as simply a personal choice between two individuals. Instead, it linked two families together, creating alliances that could strengthen economic and social stability. When a woman joined her husband's household, she often became part of a complex network of relationships involving parents, siblings, and other relatives. This extended household structure created both support and responsibility. Living with multiple generations allowed families to share labor and resources. Elders could help guide younger members, while younger adults provided the strength needed for demanding work. At the same time, such arrangements required patience and respect to maintain harmony among many personalities living under one roof. Over the years, individuals gradually moved through different roles within this family system. A young child grew into a worker. A worker eventually became a parent. A parent later became an elder whose experience guided others. Each stage carried its own expectations and responsibilities. This steady progression created a sense of order that helped families navigate the challenges of life. Old age, when it was reached, often brought a position of honor. Elders were valued for their wisdom and memory of earlier times. Their stories about past events, difficult seasons, and family traditions offered guidance to younger generations. Sitting in courtyards or near household fires, they could recount how life had changed over the decades, while reminding listeners of the principles that should remain constant. In this way, Daily life in ancient China unfolded not only through seasons and years, but through generations. The same routines: planting crops, raising children, honoring ancestors, cooperating with neighbors, continued again and again, carried forward by each new group of families. And within that slow rhythm of generational change, the deeper continuity of Chinese civilization was quietly maintained. While dynasties might rise and fall across the centuries, the structure of everyday life remained anchored in these family-centered traditions that passed from one generation to the next.